The late 1950s were a time of gnawing, high-altitude fear in the corridors of American power. The comforting thunder of B-52 Stratofortresses, the backbone of Strategic Air Command, was a constant reminder of U.S. strength. It was also a mask for a deep-seated anxiety. The Soviets had shocked the world with Sputnik, proving their rocket technology was not just competitive, but Ling Xian. Now, the whispers began, carried on the thin, cold wind that blew from the east. They spoke of a new Soviet bomber, a beast of the sky designed for one purpose: to shatter the oceanic moat that had protected the American homeland for centuries. In the labyrinthine, fluorescent-lit offices of the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence, rumors coalesced into a file, thick with grainy photographs taken from the periphery of Soviet airshows and transcripts of intercepted radio chatter. The file was codenamed Project Stork. The analysts, men like Sam Gable who had cut their teeth on the MiG-15 in Korea, felt a familiar dread. This wasn't just another incremental improvement. The whispers described something monstrous. Defectors, the human flotsam of the Cold War, were the primary source. They were engineers, radar operators, even a disgruntled ground crew chief. They were debriefed in safe houses from Berlin to Tokyo, their stories cross-referenced and poked for inconsistencies. And on one point, they were unnervingly consistent. They all repeated a phrase that seemed to defy the fundamental logic of strategic bombing. A Czech aviation engineer, smuggled out in the trunk of a diplomatic car, put it bluntly, "It is designed for a one-way mission. It can fly to America, but it cannot fly back." The initial reaction in Washington was a mixture of derision and profound confusion. At the Pentagon, the Air Force general famously scoffed, "What, do they plan to parachute into Disneyland after they drop the bomb?" But the laughter was hollow, nervous. In the White House Situation Room, the implications were picked apart with grim seriousness. A bomber that could only fly one way was not a weapon. It was a statement. It was a machine built for a doctrine of absolute, suicidal commitment. It meant the Soviets were planning for a war of annihilation, not a war of attrition. It suggested a level of desperation, or perhaps a fanaticism, that the carefully calibrated game of nuclear deterrence had not accounted for. Did the crews know? Were they volunteers for a martyrdom mission? The psychological profile of an enemy willing to build and crew such a weapon was, in some ways, more frightening than the weapon itself. Washington didn't know whether to laugh or panic. So, they did both, in measured, secret doses. They authorized more U-2 overflights, pushing the fragile, glider-like spy planes deeper into Soviet airspace, their cameras hungry for a glimpse of the one-way titan. The order was clear: find the bomber, understand it, and answer the maddening question: why would any nation build a weapon it couldn't bring home? The proof arrived not from a daring U-2 flight, but from the silent, robotic eye of a Corona spy satellite. In the summer of 1960, as the world was rocked by the downing of Gary Powers' U-2, a film canister recovered over the Pacific contained a crystal-clear image of the Ramenskoye airfield, the Soviet Union's premier flight test center. There, parked on the tarmac amidst the familiar shapes of Tu-95 Bears and MiG-21 fishbeds, was something entirely new. In the Photo Interpretation Center at NPIC, the analysts gathered around the light table, their murmurs falling to a hushed silence. The aircraft was a vision from the future, or perhaps from a particularly aggressive issue of Popular Mechanics. It was colossal, its lines sharp and predatory. It had 4 massive turbojet engines, paired in pods under dramatically swept-back wings. Its fuselage was not a tube, but a flattened, arrowhead-shaped wedge, a design meant to slice through the air at tremendous speed. It looked less like a bomber and more like a spaceship that had forgotten to leave the atmosphere. NATO's naming committee, which bestowed upon Soviet aircraft names starting with A, B, for bombers, reached for the dictionary. The name they chose was Bounder. It was perfect. The aircraft looked like it was pushing against the very limits of physics. Its design so audacious it seemed to be breaking a rule just by sitting on the ground. The CIA's Soviet Aviation Division worked feverishly to build a profile. The manufacturer was identified as the Myasishov Design Bureau, a rival to the more established Tupolev and Ilyushin Bureau. Vladimir Myasishov was known as a visionary, a man obsessed with pushing the performance envelope, often at the cost of practicality. The Bounder, designated the M50 by the Soviets, was his magnum opus. But the real shock, the moment that transformed awe into bewildered anxiety, came when the CIA obtained the first hard performance data. It wasn't stolen by a spy. It was painstakingly pieced together from 1,000 sources. The analysis of the runway length at Ramenskoye, the known thrust of the Soloviev D-15 turbojet, the fuel capacity estimated from the fuselage dimension, and finally, a goldmine, a partial, smuggled copy of the official Soviet flight test report. The numbers were worse, and stranger, than anyone had expected. The Bounder was fast, terrifyingly fast for a bomber of its size. It could push past Mach 0.99, brushing against the sound barrier. Its service ceiling was over 50,000 feet, putting it in the rarefied air where only the best interceptors could operate. But its range was the mystery. The initial Soviet claims, broadcast for propaganda purposes, were of an intercontinental range. But the real data told a different story. The Bounder was a fuel-hungry monster. Its 4 jet engines gulped kerosene at an astonishing rate. The calculations, checked and rechecked by CIA engineers, came to a startling conclusion. Fully loaded with fuel and a simulated nuclear payload, the M50 could, in theory, just barely make it to the east coast of the United States. It would be a grueling. The defectors had been right on that count. The return trip, however, was a flat impossibility. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. There was simply not enough physical space in the airframe to hold the fuel required for a round-trip mission across the Atlantic. The bomber could reach its target, but it would have nowhere near the fuel to turn around and fly home. It was, by design, a one-way weapon. The question now haunting the analysts was no longer, why would Mezhishov, a brilliant engineer, create such a flawed masterpiece? Why would the Soviet High Command greenlight it? The answer, they would soon discover, lay not in the realm of aviation, but in the dark, desperate logic of the early Cold War. The Soviet propaganda machine, a well-oiled instrument of psychological warfare, went into overdrive. In magazines like Pravda and Krasnaya Zvezda, the M-50 inches Bounder was presented as the ultimate vindication of Soviet technological prowess. It was the aviation sword of the motherland, a long-range nuclear bomber that could strike any target on the globe. Glossy, retouched photographs showed the sleek, futuristic aircraft climbing into the heavens, a trail of fire from its 4 powerful engines, a symbol of inexorable socialist power. At the 1961 Tushino Air Show, it made a single, breathtaking, low-level pass, its roar a physical blow to the chests of the Western military attachés frantically scribbling notes. It was a masterpiece of theater. But in the reality of the hangars at Ramenskoye and the classified reports circulating within the Soviet Air Force's long-range aviation brand, the truth was starkly different. The Bounder was a magnificent facade hiding a critical, crippling flaw. It was a tiger with the lungs of a house cat. The CIA, having obtained the performance data, now assembled a team of its own aeronautical engineers to conduct a virtual autopsy. Led by a brilliant, cynical former Lockheed Skunk Works engineer named Dr. Leo Kessler, the team built a mathematical model of the M50, feeding in every known parameter. The results were a confirmation of their worst, and most baffling, suspicions. The engines were the heart of the problem. The Soloviev D-15 turbojets were experimental power plants, pushing the limits of Soviet metallurgy and combustion science. They produced immense thrust, but they were notoriously inefficient, especially at the high altitudes where the Bounder was designed to fly. They were thirsty, as Kessler put it, like a marathon runner with a drinking problem. At cruising speed and altitude, the fuel flow meters would spin like carnival wheels, draining the vast internal tanks at a rate that gave flight planners nightmares. The airframe itself was another culprit. To achieve its high-altitude performance, the Mezhishov Bureau had made it incredibly strong and heavy. The wing spar was a massive titanium forging. The skin was thick, stressed aluminum. This weight came at a direct cost to Rain. Every extra kilogram of airframe was a kilogram of fuel that couldn't be carried. It was a brutal trade-off, speed and altitude for endurance. The Bounder had chosen the former, catastrophically. Kessler's team ran the numbers again and again. The conclusion was inescapable. It has almost no usable combat range, he wrote in his final assessment. The term, intercontinental, is a gross misrepresentation. It is, at best, a very long-range regional bomber with a single, very specific mission profile. And worst of all, the flaw was fundamental. The designers could not fix the range issue without gutting the aircraft. They couldn't make the engines more efficient. That would require a decade of metallurgical research the Soviets didn't have. They couldn't significantly lighten the airframe without compromising its structural integrity at high Mach numbers. They couldn't add more fuel tanks. There was no physical space left. The aircraft was a perfectly balanced equation of compromises, and the variable for range had been solved for zero. The mission profile that emerged from the simulations was chilling in its finality. If the Bounder took off from a base in the western USSR with full fuel and a nuclear payload, it could theoretically make it to the American coastline. It would be a flat-out, maximum power dash, flying at the very edge of its performance envelope. It would have to hope for perfect weather, no headwinds, and no interception. But the moment it crossed the coastline, it was out of options. The fuel gauges would be deep in the red. There would be no turning around, no possibility of evading enemy defenses on the return leg, no hope of reaching a neutral or friendly airfield, not enough fuel to get home. The crew's fate would be sealed, a watery grave in the Atlantic, a crash landing on foreign soil, or, if they were following their final orders, continuing inland to a secondary target before their fuel was completely exhausted. It was, in every practical, operational sense, a one-way bomber. A suicide machine. The defectors hadn't been exaggerating or misinformed. They had been describing a terrifying, deliberate design reality. To understand why a rational state would pour billions of rubles and the efforts of its best minds into such a flawed weapon, one had to viscerally feel the cold sweat panic that gripped the Soviet high command in the late 1950s. It was a period of profound strategic vulnerability, a time when the very survival of the Soviet state felt precarious. The source of this panic was the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. For the men in the Kremlin, the B-52 was not just an aircraft, it was an existential threat made manifest. It was a constant, circling presence. While Soviet bombers were largely limited to missions over Eurasia, the B-52 could circle the entire world. It could launch from bases in the United States, the UK, Spain, and Guam, approaching the Soviet Union from any direction. And most gallingly, it could refuel in midair, a capability the Soviets had yet to master on a large scale. This gave the B-52 a seemingly limitless loiter time and an unstoppable global reach. The Strategic Air Command kept a portion of its fleet in the air at all times, a relentless, airborne sword of Damocles. The Soviet response, the Tu-95 Bear, was a brilliant design in its own right, but it was a propeller-driven aircraft in a jet age. It was slower, lower flying, and far more vulnerable to the new generation of American supersonic interceptors like the F-102 and F-106. The psychological disparity was immense. The Bear looked like a relic, the B-52 looked like the future. This perceived bomber gap created a political firestorm within the Soviet military-industrial complex. Nikita Khrushchev, a leader who thrived on bold, dramatic gestures, demanded an answer. He wanted a symbol. He wanted a Soviet bomber that could look the B-52 in the eye and make it blink. The order came down from the Politburo with the force of a decree: produce a bomber that was faster, higher flying, and more modern than anything the Americans possessed. The task fell to Vladimir Myasishchev, an engineer known for his ambition and his willingness to challenge the conservative Tupolev Bureau. But he was given an impossible brief. The project was launched under immense political pressure, with unrealistic deadlines dictated not by engineering reality, but by the party Congress schedule. The message was clear: have something to show us, and soon. The M50 was born from this pressure cooker. It was designed in a rush, with technology the USSR didn't yet fully understand. The high-performance turbojets were not ready. The metallurgy for the lightweight, high-strength airframe was still in the laboratory. But to admit this was career suicide. So, the Myasishchev Bureau pressed on, making heroic compromises. They used heavier materials where lighter ones were needed. They installed engines that were fuel inefficient because they were the only ones powerful enough to get the massive aircraft into the air. They prioritized the sizzle over the steak, the breathtaking visual and speed performance that would wow politicians at an air show, over the mundane, crucial metric of combat range. The result was exactly what the engineers feared: a bomber that looked revolutionary on the outside, a masterpiece of aerodynamic form, but was operationally useless on the inside. It was a Potemkin village of airpower. The Soviet Air Force knew it. The pilots assigned to the test program were among the best in the world, and they understood the numbers. They knew the aircraft was a dead end. Whispers and internal memos, later uncovered, referred to it as the Khrushchev Special, or, more darkly, the Flying Coffin. They understood that a combat mission in the M50 would be a one-way ticket. But in the rigid, top-down structure of the Soviet military, their objections were stifled. The machine was a political statement first and a weapon a distant second. Washington, however, didn't know this. Not yet. All they saw was the terrifying silhouette on the satellite photos, the blistering speed in the flight reports, and the chilling, consistent testimony of the defectors. They saw the tiger's teeth, but they couldn't yet see its weak heart. The Bounder, for all its flaws, was achieving its primary objective. It was sowing fear and confusion in the West, forcing the Americans to waste resources and mental energy on a threat that, in the cold light of day, didn't truly exist. The greatest weapon of the M50 was not its bomb bay, but the shadow it cast. The morning of July 9, 1961, dawned bright and clear over Tushino Airfield, just outside Moscow. The air was thick with the smell of jet fuel and collective anticipation. It was Aviation Day, a national holiday and a meticulously choreographed spectacle of Soviet might. Grandstands were packed with party officials, foreign diplomats, and a sea of citizens waving red flags. The sky was a stage, and today's performance was designed for one audience above all others: the horrified Western military attachés sitting in their designated section, their binoculars and cameras at the ready. The show was a relentless parade of power. Formations of MiG-21s sliced through the air in perfect unison. The lumbering, unmistakable shape of the Tu-95 Bear bomber droned past, its contra-rotating propellers a blur. But the crowd, and the world, was waiting for the main event. The rumors had been circulating for months, fed by carefully placed articles in Pravda. The aviation sword was about to be unsheathed. Then, a low, building rumble, different from the propellers of the Bear. It was a deeper, more visceral thrum, the sound of raw, jet-powered fury. From the eastern approach, a shape emerged, growing rapidly against the sun. A wave of murmurs, then outright cheers, swept through the crowd. The M50 Bounder was a sight to steal the breath. The morning sun glinted off its pristine, silver-white skin, making it look less like a machine and more like a sliver of polished starfall. Its 4 engines, slung in 2 massive pods under the sharply swept wings, trailed faint, shimmering heat hazes. It was huge, yet its lines were so clean, so aggressive, it seemed to be moving faster than it was. It thundered directly over the grandstands, its engine noise a physical pressure on the eardrums, a howl that spoke of speed and power. It was a single, perfect, low-level pass, a predator showing its teeth before vanishing back into the sky. In the western enclave, the reaction was a controlled, professional panic. Notepads were filled with frantic sketches. Cameras whirred and clicked. One U.S. Air Force attaché was overheard muttering to his British counterpart, "My God, they've done it." The public relations victory for the Soviets was instantaneous and total. The next day, newspapers across the United States and Europe carried banner headlines: "Soviets unveil new super bomber," and "Khrushchev's ace in the hole." For a terrified public, still reeling from Sputnik, the Bounder was a new, terrifying symbol of American vulnerability. But what the cheering crowds and the alarmed attachés could not see was the reality inside the cockpit. At the controls was test pilot Nikolai Goryanov, a man known for his ice-cool nerves. But today, even he was sweating. The aircraft he was flying was not the polished marvel it appeared to be. It was a handful, a beast fighting its own limitations. As it had lined up for its dramatic pass, the number 3 engine had shown a temperature spike, the gauge flickering dangerously into the red. Goryanov had been forced to manually reduce its thrust, fighting a slight yaw as the asymmetric power tried to pull the aircraft off course. The Bounder was, in fact, underpowered for its weight. The experimental D-15 engines were running at near maximum output just to maintain this sedate, parade speed pass. At this low altitude and slow speed, they were gulping fuel and running dangerously hot, their cooling systems struggling to cope. The airframe itself felt heavy, sluggish on the controls. It was struggling to maintain its speed and altitude. The grand, majestic pass was not a display of effortless superiority, it was a white-knuckle balancing act, a performance pushed to the very edge of the aircraft's fragile envelope. Goryanov knew, as he waved to the crowd from the cockpit, a gesture of confidence mandated by the Politburo, that he had mere minutes of fuel and engine tolerance remaining. The moment the Bounder disappeared from the view of the grandstands, the performance was over. The radio crackled with a terse command from the ground controller: "Mission complete. Return to base immediately." There was no triumphant lap, no secondary pass. Goryanov pushed the throttles forward, nursing the overheating engines, and pointed the sleek nose towards Ramenskoye, a mere 50 miles away. The flight that had fooled the world lasted less than 20 minutes from takeoff to landing. The aviation sword was returned to its scabbard, its blade already cracked. It was a masterpiece of illusion, a magician's trick where the prestige was the simple, desperate act of landing safely. The stunning display at Tushino triggered a full-scale intelligence panic in Washington. The CIA's Soviet Aviation Division, under Sam Gable, was tasked with answering one question: how many of these things are there, and what is their true capability? Operation Stork was given the highest priority, its resources dwarfing even the hunt for the Phantom transport. The answers, which trickled in over the next year from a mosaic of sources, did not bring relief. They brought a slow dawning realization of a colossal Soviet bluff. Aerial reconnaissance was the first key. The new generation of KH-5 Argon and KH-6 Lanyard satellites, with their improved resolution, were tasked with a continuous watch on Ramenskoye and the Myasishov factory at Philly. The imagery told a damning story. They could always find the same single M50 airframe, the one that had flown at Tushino. It was often seen parked on the tarmac, sometimes with maintenance crews swarming over it, but it flew only rarely. More tellingly, analysts could never find a second, fully assembled aircraft. They spotted components, a fuselage section here, a wing there, for a second prototype, but it remained in a state of perpetual incompletion, a skeleton gathering dust in a hangar. The Soviet production line, it appeared, had stalled after one single, showpiece model. The human intelligence confirmed the technical. A defector, a mid-level administrator from the Ministry of Aviation Industry, provided the final, conclusive pieces. Under debriefing in a safe house in West Germany, he laid out the program's obituary. The M50 project, he confirmed, was in a state of collapse. The engines were a maintenance nightmare, requiring complete overhauls after a handful of flight hours. The airframe was plagued by persistent stress cracks, a result of the heavy structure being pushed to its limits. The political will to fund a solution had evaporated. Khrushchev, once the project's champion, was now increasingly enamored with the new, flashier technology of intercontinental ballistic missiles, which promised a swifter, cheaper, and more certain path to destruction. But the most damning evidence came from the defector's memory. He had seen the internal performance assessment reports, the ones never meant for Western eyes. He recited the numbers, the same numbers Dr. Kessler's theorized. The true, unvarnished operational radius of the bomber. It could reach the Atlantic, the defector stated flatly. It just couldn't return to Soviet territory. He elaborated, even under the most optimistic scenarios, stripping out non-essential equipment, flying at the most economical cruise settings, the mathematics were unforgiving. The fuel required for a round trip simply could not be contained within the airframe's fixed volume. Proposals for aerial refueling had been studied and rejected. The M50's airframe was too fragile, its flight characteristics too unstable, to safely rendezvous with a tanker aircraft. A radical redesign would be tantamount to starting from scratch, a cost and time investment the Kremlin was no longer willing to make. The CIA's final assessment, drafted in the autumn of 1962, was a masterpiece of grim conclusion. The M-50 inches bounder was not a weapon. It was a symbol, a multi-billion ruble scarecrow, built to frighten the West and to serve as a propaganda tool for domestic consumption. It was a threat on paper, not in the air. Its existence had forced the U.S. to expend immense resources on countermeasures, new interceptors, improved radar, advanced surface-to-air missiles, all to counter a phantom. The greatest achievement of the bounder was not a single mile it flew, but the shadow of fear it cast across an ocean, a shadow that lingered long after the aircraft itself had been relegated to a museum piece. The Soviets had not built a bomber, they had built a psychological operation with wings. The political winds in Moscow had been shifting for months, and in the world of Soviet high technology, a change in the political climate was more destructive than any hurricane. By 1963, Nikita Khrushchev, the man who had once championed the M50 as a symbol of Soviet prowess, found his own power base eroding. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had been a humiliating backdown, revealing the folly of nuclear brinkmanship when your strategic hand was weaker than your bluff. The vast, expensive bomber fleet, with its vulnerable bases and long flight times, now seemed like a relic of a bygone era compared to the swift, unstoppable certainty of an ICBM. The M50, the aviation sword, was now an embarrassment. It was a gleaming, expensive reminder of a failed strategy. Its ongoing technical woes were a drain on the budget and a source of quiet mockery among the rival Tupolev and Ilyushin design bureaus. The final flight logs, which would later fall into CIA hands, told the pathetic story. The mighty bounder, the terror of Western imaginations, had flown a grand total of just 19 test flights. Most were short, cautious hops around Ramenskoye. None had pushed beyond basic prototype envelope expansion. None had ever ventured on a long-range endurance test. None had even remotely approached the U.S. border or any simulated target. The aircraft designed to strike fear into America couldn't reliably reach Paris without exhausting its fuel reserves. Khrushchev needed a scapegoat and a new narrative. He found both in a single, stunning public announcement delivered to the Supreme Soviet in the autumn of 1963. Pounding the podium for emphasis, his voice booming through the Great Hall, he declared, "The era of the bomber is over. The era of the missile has begun." It was a masterstroke of political jujitsu. It was not an admission of failure, but a proclamation of progress. He was not canceling a failed bomber program, he was boldly leading the nation into a new, more advanced age of warfare. The statement was a polite, public way of admitting defeat while painting it as a visionary triumph. Behind the scenes, the order was executed with brutal, bureaucratic efficiency. The M50 program was cancelled within days of the speech. There was no ceremony, no final flight. A team of technicians from the 12th Directorate arrived at the hangar in Ramenskoye. The aircraft's classified documents were seized. Its advanced radar and navigation systems were unbolted and crated for storage in a secure vault. The 4 temperamental Soloviev D-15 engines were hoisted out of their nacelles, destined for a research institute where they would be studied as a cautionary tale in propulsion engineering. The airframe itself, now just a hollow, silver shell, was towed by a tractor to a remote, unheated storage hangar on the edge of the airfield. The massive doors were closed, and the lock was secured. The bounder was left to sit in the gloom, surrounded by the ghosts of other failed prototypes, its sleek lines gathering a fine layer of dust. The Soviets had spent years and a fortune equivalent to billions of dollars building a transatlantic bomber that, in the end, was less capable than the propeller-driven bear it was meant to replace. It was a monument to the immense gap between Soviet ambition and Soviet engineering reality. Today, the sole surviving M50 bounder does not sit in a remote hangar. It has been moved to the Central Air Force Museum in Monino, a quiet town outside Moscow. It is parked on the grass, under the vast Russian sky, surrounded by the successful, proven aircraft of the Soviet era, the MiGs, the Sukhois, the Tupolevs. To the casual visitor, it is still a breathtaking sight. Its silver skin is faded now, scarred by decades of weather and neglect, but its futuristic, arrowhead shape still looks like it belongs to the next century, not the last. It remains one of the most striking, aesthetically daring aircraft ever built. And it is also one of the most profoundly misunderstood. For decades, its story was told in whispers and fragments. The West had feared it, pouring millions into countermeasures for a threat that existed only on a blueprint and in a propaganda film. The Soviets had pretended it worked, using its formidable appearance to project an image of invincibility they did not truly possess. Both superpowers, in their own way, were complicit in the myth of the bounder. But the engineers, the men like Vladimir Myasishov and his team, they knew the truth all along. They had conceived a machine of breathtaking beauty and ambition, but they had been hamstrung by a system that valued political deadlines over technical perfection, that demanded miracles without providing the tools to perform them. They knew the numbers. They knew the aircraft's terrifying thirst for fuel, its structural hesitations, its engine's fragile temperament. It could cross the ocean one way, on paper, in a theoretical vacuum with perfect weather and no interceptors. But reality, with its headwinds, its mechanical failures, and its immutable laws of physics, had grounded it forever. It never stood a chance. The bounder's true legacy is not as a weapon of war, but as a cautionary tale. It is a stark reminder that in the high-stakes theater of the Cold War, the most dangerous weapons weren't always the ones that flew, or the ones that worked. Sometimes, they were the ones that merely looked like they might. The psychological impact of a potential threat could be as potent as the threat itself, forcing an adversary to divert priceless resources, alter grand strategy, and lie awake at night staring at the ceiling, haunted by a ghost. The M50 was a phantom, a silver bullet that could never be fired, but for a few, tense years, its shadow was long enough to darken the entire world.